Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy, founder of Integral Recovery and CEO of iAwake Technologies. And our topic today is one that is very timely and very important. It's policing. And we have with us two really extraordinary police representatives, both of them not only having long and very distinguished careers in policing, but also being contemplative practitioners, integrally informed, doing work in a variety of very innovative and creative ways. And they are Chris Orrey, who is a retired police officer, formerly with Hayward City, also a college instructor, an ordained minister, and now creating an integral policing initiative, and if in a spare time, doing a PhD degree in comparative religion and philosophy. And our other guest is Ryan Johansen, who is currently chief of police in San Bruno City in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Ryan is, in addition to how long and distinguished career in policing, is also doing further study. He's created the Ever-Present Love, which is a way of creating a library of loving messages that can live in perpetuity. And also doing further study, and a mindfulness practitioner and teacher. And on his website is what I thought was just a really beautiful description of some of an ideal of what it takes to be an effective police person in these days. And he said, the only way to meet the community demands of modern day policing is to deploy officers who are healthy, happy, and well-adjusted human beings with a deep commitment to a well-articulated purpose. And it struck me, wow, there we have an integral perspective and what's called a meta-modern perspective, a perspective which recognizes that effective functioning societies require mature, healthy individuals. So beautiful. So Chris, Ryan, welcome. Thank you so much for all you're doing and for being available for a conversation on a very timely topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's an honor to be with you both.
And yeah, I just want to add that Chris retired as a lieutenant. So that's, to me, that's impressive. That's nothing to sneeze at all. So yeah. Well, I guess every podcast host says they're really excited to have their guests, but I'm really excited to have you guys here because I have in the 70s, my brother was a border patrol. So I kind of hang out with a lot of law enforcement types. And I was kind of a hippie, kind of an, I don't know what, but at a certain point that didn't work for me anymore. So I joined the United States military, the Army, and became a military policeman and then an investigator. So I have a background, and often in integral circles, this is not what we talk about. And it's so important. I have so many questions for you guys, and I'm so deeply moved by the careers you've chosen. It's a very, very honorable path. And it's one of self-sacrifice. And obviously there's bad cops, good cops, but in general, in my experience, most cops are good and they're doing their best. And I can't imagine our country without you guys and what you've done. And for those of you who don't know what integral is, because we're all integrally informed, and that is basically a model that developed by Ken Wilber and the rest of us who've been working on it for years. But I explain it as a multi-dimensional map of holism, right? Because we used to say you want to be holistic. Well, that could mean anything, little of this, little of that, and all that. And that's really good, but there's no way to organize it and see how it fits together. And through Ken's work, it all began to see how these things can be improved. And Chris, we had a conversation I don't know, a couple of months ago, and it was just like we were just rocking. They're so excited about this stuff. So I just wanted to say that. Oh, and I wanted to put in there, I found this, I dusted it off. I don't even know, dusted it off. But that's me a couple of years ago as a young military policeman. And that almost became my career, but it didn't. And anyway, I just want to say it's a real honor and privilege to be here with you guys. And I have a lot of questions. How do we want to get rolling here?
Well, I'd like to actually begin by just acknowledging that take a bigger picture on policing, because often we think of it as just law enforcement. But my experience, I've had the good fortune of working with and frankly being protected by police, working in emergency rooms and with addicts and homeless people as in my role as a psychiatrist. And I'm aware that the police, you fill many roles, law enforcement being just one of them, but also effectively social worker, mental health consultant, mediator, counselor, emergency medical technicians. And there are probably more roles, but perhaps you could speak to the multifaceted dimensionality of what we simply call policing.
And I would add special ops, kicking in doors and getting bad guys, that's part of it too. So you talk about, and I don't know how you organize that, if you expect each cop to have all those abilities, or you single them out and get the good, whatever the skill sets are. But why don't you guys talk for a while, and we won't.
Yeah, I'd like to just briefly respond, because Ryan gives the most amazing answer I've ever heard on this, especially in these times where the communities are really trying to take some duties away from policing and think that police should just stick with law enforcement. And Ryan and I are of the same minds that would really change the career. It would have been a very different career for me. I mean, what brought me to policing was the eclectic nature and all of those roles and all of those hats that we wear. And Ryan and I have talked about this extensively, and taking away the social worker hat and the counselor hat and the big sister, big brother hats. It would just really change the career, and not for the better. But I really want to hear Ryan's thoughts on that.
I'm not sure I could articulate it a whole lot better than you did, Chris. I'll say, Roger, that I really appreciate sort of the setup there, because I actually don't like being referred to as law enforcement. I think that even the use of the term in this very general sense it totally underplays what we actually do every day. And for your average police officer in the modern era, law enforcement is actually probably the smallest portion of what they spend their time doing. And when we're referring to police officers as law enforcement collectively all the time, I can tell you here in our department, where I'd like to think that we look at things a bit more integrally and progressively, they don't like that they feel that it completely fails to really capture what they're engaged in doing all day, every day. And to Chris's point, you're a better law enforcer in that component of the job if you are recognizing and valuing all the other components of the job, because they are always interwoven. You are not able to separate them and do this job appropriately. You may be enforcing a law, but if you're failing to look at the social elements and all of the factors that are playing into this violation that occurred that you're now called out to deal with, you're going to miss infinite opportunities to make an actual difference. And that's why, as Chris said, I'm a bit against the idea of just isolating cops into a world of law enforcement and taking away these other duties. There's also a whole other piece that we could get into, where I think part of the mental health and well-being of police officers necessitates them continuing to engage in wearing those other hats, because you've got to have some success stories and some joys to carry with the heartache and the suffering that comes with wearing this uniform for 30 years. And if you take that away from cops, I think the end result for society will not be what any of us want.
Well, you're right, Chris. He gives a beautiful response. Thank you, Ryan. That is a very, very, very comprehensive and very beautiful. And I had not thought of the importance to the police themselves of having these other roles, and the fact that, yes, these other roles would be more fulfilling. for them and make for them their health and well-being, etc. But that's very valuable. Along with this factor that the police have so many hats, it seems, again, I want to take a big picture perspective here. It seems that the police function as a kind of societal backstop that, yes, we have we have a democracy and there's a lot good here, but our society is failing a significant percentage of its population. And there's extraordinary inequality, poverty, addiction, mental health issues with inadequate treatment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems that the police of necessity are functioning as a backstop for society's failures, dealing with of necessity with the homeless, dealing with the enormous number of mentally ill on the streets, domestic disturbance, drug addiction, etc. Perhaps you could speak to this way in which you're kind of the society's last resort.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to start with that one?
No, go for it, Chief.
I don't know that I could have. I've never heard it articulated that way, but it's really quite brilliant. What's interesting about it is I think it's a role that the good cops, I'm not sure how to make that distinction, but I think it's somewhat important to make it, embrace that role, which is one of the reasons why I have to disclose my bias probably right away, in that I love police officers. And I don't use the term lightly. I love police officers. I think that the majority of police officers are exceptional humans, that they are willing to engage or to endure tremendous suffering on behalf of others, most of whom they don't know and will never actually get to know. And many of whom a lot of society has simply decided to bypass and would prefer to not even see. And so I think the fact that most cops are willing to embrace this role as a backstop, sort of a last sponge to absorb all that society has to hand out when it's not really clear who else is supposed to handle it. There have been a lot of police executives who've pushed back against that, right? Saying that there's all these things we've started to do in the last 20 or 30 years. The scope of work for law enforcement policing has vastly expanded. And they'll complain about it. That, well, this is really difficult. We have strained resources, and how are we going to handle all this? But, similar to my first point, I think it's a role that we embrace and should embrace, that somebody's got to be there to do that. And again, if we're putting out police officers who are not just law enforcers, but are healthy, happy, well-adjusted individuals, compassionate people who see and embrace that role, it's one that I think we actually serve quite well in. And that's an area that's been challenging as a police executive, is sometimes the narrative is not necessarily backed by fact, and things that we might suggest taking away from police, if you look at it a little bit more objectively, we're actually quite good at. And I think mental health intervention is one of those spaces. There's a lot of things said about maybe we shouldn't have cops with badges and guns responding to mental health emergencies, but most of them are just that. At the beginning, they're emergencies. So who else is going to respond out and make sure that, relative safety can be restored before we take on the rest of what needs to be taken on? So, yeah, I think that this idea of a backstop is, I'd like to be able to play with that a little bit in my mind, because it's quite brilliant. And I think that most cops would enjoy and embrace that philosophy.
Yeah, well, perhaps we'll come back to it. Chris, did you want to comment further on these?
It also points to the balance that we take in the community and working with other agencies. I mean, there's so many amazing agencies out there that are doing important work and more long-term. Police officers respond and have to get things under control, but we don't stay with families and people suffering long-term. And, to be able to work with those agencies and other first responders, is really, really critical. And police officers do it very well. And police officers are happy when somebody with more expertise on homelessness, for example, shows up to take a more long-term approach. And, this is where integral comes in. It's all about having balance and understanding that we cannot just send civilians without the kind of experience interacting with volatile people into a situation, expect them to handle it, yet to have a police officer who's well-trained working with a long-term professional is the best of both worlds.
Yeah. certainly been my experience as a mental health professional. Having police backup has been possibly life-saving. So, yeah. John?
Yeah, and when I was an MP, they told us that more MPs died going to familiar altercations than any other single issue. And so when you go into these things, you know, we have a country that's armed to the teeth. You know, everybody's got guns. And I think probably California has the strictest gun control laws of any state besides maybe New York. I'm not sure. But that didn't always used to be so much. And so when you go into these and you don't know what's going on, you better have somebody who knows what they're doing and can handle themselves if there is violence and you have to protect others from, you know, somebody who's lost it and is armed and is getting ready to hurt people. So, and I wanted to ask you too, something I'm very interested in is, do you feel that your police academies and your police departments were both kind of south of San Francisco in that area, is the training adequate? And how long does the police academy, the academy itself, last? And how's the state of things in training? And I imagine that screening also individuals would be a big part of it. And that's also done at police academies. You see who has it and who doesn't. So how's that going?
When I was in the police academy in 1987, I'm much older than Ryan. It was a 12-week police academy, and most of the veterans in our department thought, what the heck are you doing for 12 weeks? You know, and now it's at least 6 months. And I imagine some veterans are going, what are you doing for 6 months? You know, I don't think there is enough training to get every cop ready. Yet the training in California is, you know, quite amazing. What I would like to see is to bring some integral into the police academy training, into the hiring process, into the field training process, because any police officer knows that what they learn in the academy, you know, it's like taking a sip of water out of a fire hose, and it's really the training you get from your FTO on the street that's going to make a difference to your career. And the training you get when you become a sergeant and a lieutenant and a chief, et cetera, you know, to have a more integral response. So the training is very good in so many ways. We've added so many components. That's why it's gone from 3 months to 6 months, for example. And yet, I think that there are some things that we could interject, especially from an integral perspective, that could make it even better. And, you know, I've been retired for 6 years, so, you know, Ryan will probably have a more updated version of that. But, you know, it's something we're definitely looking at with integral policing.
Yeah, I think you pretty well covered. I mean, the academies are 6 months here in California. I have done a lot of training around the country and traveled, and that's not true everywhere. There are a lot of places where the duration of a police academy is almost shocking to the conscience, to think that short a period of time, we're going to give someone a badge and a gun and the power to deprive people of their liberty and send them out to a community. To Chris's point, I'm not sure we'll ever arrive at the conclusion that there's enough training, period. But I have to say that, just in my own very humble opinion, sometimes training is far too easy a scapegoat. We've seen that certainly in the last 5 to 10 years or so, where every time there's a problem in policing, we say that more training is the answer. And I think the reason that happens is both sides, if there were two sides to that conversation, will tend to agree with that, right? The police executives love to say, hey, this is a training issue, because that means it can be solved. And the activist side likes to say it's a training issue because, well, it means maybe it can be solved. And the reality is that I love the adage that culture eats policy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can put folks through a 2-year academy if you'd like to, and teach them all the integral concepts on the planet. And if you bring them into a toxic culture thereafter, it's going to be undone in a shockingly rapid fashion. And they will immediately acclimate into the culture that they are being asked to acclimate to, and quickly erase the things that we teach them to do. I hold a very deep-rooted belief that in California, at least, with the exhaustive measures we take before we hire cops, let alone put them out on the street on their own, the vast majority of police officers who get to that point are phenomenally wonderful people with all the right intentions, and they came to the job for the right reasons. So if 4 or 5 years down the road, they do something unthinkable and are showing an indifference towards human life, Whose fault is that? And the problem is that we have failed to acknowledge that it's probably the department's fault, the culture of the department, and the community. We share responsibility there, because this wonderful person came in one side, and within a matter of years, we managed to break them to the point where they will do something that they would have never have done the day they walked in the door. And so while I think training is really, really important, I think that what's even more important is the recognition that maintaining someone in a state of readiness to do this job at the level of relative perfection that's required is a constant undertaking. And the training is never done, and the mentoring and the maintenance of culture is never over. It's exhausting. And it needs to be really kind of at the forefront of what we look at and do. Chris mentioned FTO, the Field Training Officer Program. We've all experienced it, right? It used to be that you came out of the academy, you worked so hard for 6 months, and you learn all these things. And you come out of the very first FTO you sit in the car with says, hey, that's really great. Now forget all that nonsense and let me teach you how to really do the job. I get the spirit of that is that practically you can't really know in the classroom what this is going to be like. And here comes your wake-up call, kid. But at the end of the day, if that FTO is not standing up the right kind of healthy culture from that first day, that very first moment on, that young recruit will begin acclimating to what they think they need to survive within that culture and to belong within that culture. And that's where we see, in my opinion, the disasters.
And Ryan, how do you rectify that? I know exactly what you're talking about. So how do you fix that?
Well, that's an awesome segue into talking about, in my opinion, integral. Especially, the tip of the spear, the edge of the sword, the leadership. The integral leadership to me is essential in modern day policing. We talk a lot with the folks over at Integral Life about the difficulty of going to like line level police officers and trying to explain integral theory. I don't know that that's necessary. The reality is they kind of need to know what time it is. They may not need to know how the clock works. But at the top, there's got to be folks who are really seeing the complexities of the environment in which we operate. And they need a framework through which to make sense of those complexities as they're making day-to-day decisions. Here for us, that's been integral, but plain and simple. That to me is where I think the transition began to occur here is having a leadership team that uses, we could get as practical as you'd like here. We started with simplicity with the 4 quadrants. And the way that we started to use the 4 quadrants, because again, even with my command staff, I didn't want to ask them to go read, sex ecology and spirituality. And then now we're all of a sudden going to know how to run a police department. So instead, we taught about the 4 quadrants. And I look at those 4 quadrants, if you can kind of visualize, as like the old Play-Doh factories we used when we were kids. And at a command staff level, we take a decision, whether it's personnel related or community related or critical incident related, and we shove it into the 4 quadrants and we plunge down that Play-Doh factory plunger and we see what comes out the other end. And if one of those quadrants gets clogged and 4 different things don't come out the other end, we know that we're not ready to make that decision yet. And as a result, we're making more integral decisions. So we are looking at culture when we make a decision like how to discipline an officer over something that occurred out on the street. We're looking at culture and we're thinking about whether or not to institute a new policy. We're looking at the individual, the collective, the interior, the exterior, not perfectly, believe me, we have a long way to go. But I think that integral view at the top has begun to create a culture where we're not breaking cops anymore. And I could talk forever about the specifics of what that means, but I'll shut up and allow Chris to maybe opine.
Yeah, and I just want to address the quadrants a little bit. And I know not everybody's familiar with them, as far as the deep transformation community, but it became a big deal in my thesis when I was looking at police reform. And, the quadrants are basically, and Roger and John, you please add anything you have to this, because I'm still a rookie when it comes to integral. But the upper quadrants are the interior, are the individual. The lower quadrants are the collective. The left hand are the interior and the right hand are the exterior. So your upper left quadrant is the interior of the individual, our psychology, our psyche, et cetera. And the upper right is the exterior of the individual. It's, where neuroscience comes in and how our brains work and our behavior. And then you flip those down to the collective and you've got the interior, the collective, which is society's values and culture, et cetera. And then you've got the exterior of the collective, which is systems, et cetera. And what I saw in my thesis work was, and I actually listed them and put them in the different categories of the quadrants, that most police reform efforts are hitting the right-hand quadrants. It's the exterior of the police officer, their behavior, how they come to something, and it's the exterior of the collective, it's policies, procedures, training, etc. So all of our responses to the issues of policing, not all, the vast majority have been right-hand quadrant responses. And what Ryan's talking about with police culture and societal culture are left-hand quadrant responses. And that's where, when we talk about having a more integral approach to training, to addressing these issues, we are wanting to bring in all four quadrants, and that Play-Doh factory is such a great, analogy and visual for that. But it's really huge and it's really significant. And people haven't caught on to it yet, beyond integral thinkers or people that have kind of an innate or intuitive integral approach to things.
And perhaps you could say something about what the qualities of a healthy as opposed to a toxic culture are in this world.
Yeah, well, certainly I can, as I think it relates to a police department. A healthy police culture is going to look a lot like a healthy organizational culture anywhere else, which is kind of fascinating, because when you review the literature on police culture and then you review the literature on organizational culture, it's like we throw out all the principles we learned about organizational culture when we look at cops. And we just think that it's so inherently different. And it's not, actually. We face different challenges, but if you embrace the idea that a culture is the result of how a group chooses to cope with its shared challenges, which I think most the literature tends to agree on, then we're just another organization. It's just that we have slightly different and in some cases more profound challenges than some other professions or organizational groups. So
Ryan, I'm sorry, before this, I've got to get this in. You finished the last time you're talking with the phrase breaking cops. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah. And I think it's actually, there's overlap here in those two questions, because, if the idea, and I really believe that, if the idea is that wonderful people come in the front end and somehow over a matter of however many years, depending on their experiences, we break them, then the coping mechanisms, how we teach them to cope with the challenges of the job, becomes central. It not just to their own individual success, but to the collective culture, to how we identify as a group. And so what we've chosen to focus on here is making sure that in advance of trauma, we are providing the right tools and mechanisms to cope with the traumas of this job that are going to be inevitable. And we're coalescing that with a change of concept. I think as we started to talk about officer wellness over the last decade, it was similar to how a parent looks at protecting their kids. You want to shield officers from trauma. This will never happen. At some point, there has to be a segment of society that is willing to stand in front of and with the traumas of the human condition. And so we try to teach cops that there's sort of this mathematical equation, right? The goal here of our wellness program is resilience, because you have to be incredibly resilient in order to do this job and to do it well and to survive. And the mathematical equation for resilience that we use here, that everyone here is familiar with, is it's trauma plus integration equals resilience. So it's very easy to see, of course, integration, right? You have to integrate your life experiences, whether that means, at some levels, professional counseling or contemplative practices or a whole litany of things. But the thing that gets ignored is the value of the trauma. And without the trauma, there's no friction. And without the trauma, there's nothing to integrate and there's no resilience. And so we're learning to embrace the trauma of the job, understand that it's sort of a rite of passage, as long as it's properly processed and integrated. And that's been the bigger challenge, because the culture in policing is, put up and shut up. Be tough. You should not sit here and talk about how that call you went to last night has really messed with you and you're having trouble sleeping, or you went to that SIDS case and now you can't leave your child alone to sleep in their crib. You're walking in there every 5 minutes. Those things were just sworn off. You don't talk about them. Instead, you go have a few beers with the boys. You pretend like it never bothered you and you go right back to work. And what we've done here is embrace the fact that that's just flat out ridiculous. It doesn't work for any other group or culture, and it's not going to work for cops. And we have normalized, and I'm happy to talk more about how, the better ways of coping with the traumas of this job. So if you embrace the traumas and then you understand, we've got a deep-rooted peer support program. We've got completely anonymous counseling services. So none of the stigma that comes with EAP or working through workers' comp when you've had a difficult run of something. We've got truly, completely separated confidential counseling you can go to. I literally just pay the bill. I have no clue who uses it, how often they use it, when they go there to use it. We've got on-duty exercise time. So everyone's got a full hour every single day at work to physically work out the traumas of the job. Everyone's got wellness time during every single shift, where they can go into the wellness room. And we've provided a full 3.5-day mindfulness intensive for every single officer. So they learn some of the base practices for how to sit with the traumas and integrate them and reflect upon them. So those are just some of the things. But I think that when you talk about a healthy culture versus an unhealthy, it has to do with the same thing, these coping mechanisms.
So bringing the interiors into policing, if you will, in the 4 quadrants. Not only do you have to have everything in the exterior squared away, but you have to pay attention to the interiors. And that obviously will help your police officers to have more presence, that when they show up, and people will feel that, and they'll know that an ally is showing up. If you are ally, not if you're arresting, even if you're arresting. In the apprehensions that I made, I was always very, very respectful of the people that I was putting in handcuffs, and it was just, who I was. But bringing in that interior aspect is, it's so important, and it's brilliant. You guys are doing this. I would love to have been a cop in your department, Ryan. It's really amazing.
I say that all the time, John.
Yeah. And also I get from you guys, and I don't know if you could reinforce this, or this sounds like a cliche or something, but to realize that what you guys are doing is a noble profession. It's like being a priest or a soldier or a Marine. It's something you're giving your life to. And I have a good friend who's Ukrainian. She's a psychologist. She's over there, and she's finding that the PTSD is not as severe as you would suspect, because there's a supportive culture. People are suffering together. It's not just some random thing that happens. You realize you're part of something bigger, and you're fighting for something that's noble, right, and good. And that seems to be a huge help in maintaining people's sanity and getting them through these traumatic and very, very difficult situations.
Absolutely.
And I was really struck by several things that you said, Ryan. There, but one was a statement. There has to be a segment of society that is willing to stand in the face of the horrors of life and deal with them. And it's like, wow, yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that way, but there does. Yes, we need a profession that is willing and trained to do that and support it in the way you are. And you didn't use this word, but one of the things it sounds like you're really doing that's novel there is reframing trauma as not just a horror to be pushed under, but friction, as you said, something that is inevitable part of life, or a part of this profession. Anyway, yes, trauma is a part of life, but it's also much more so for this profession, and something that is to be the word that comes up is honored. It's like the willingness to stand in the face of that is honored in some way and fully supported. That feels so important, and not just sucked up.
Yeah, there's been an ancillary benefit that I didn't actually identify of this reframing how you look at trauma, and that has to do with better identifying with and having more compassion for victims and survivors. As cops see themselves that way, it becomes this shared thing between them and the people that they're so ardently trying to protect and bring justice for, that there's a better rapport building there. Like I've heard cops telling stories, all cops go through plenty of things in their careers, but very early in my career, I had a couple of very marking moments. We'll call them close calls. And I always thought it's fascinating when you reach a point in your life where, as difficult as something like that was, you would trade it for nothing. often say that about, so I lost my father when I was young. He died of ALS when I was 14. And it didn't take a lot of years for me to, and family members struggled with this when I would describe it this way, that at this point in my life, if you could give me my dad back, I wouldn't take him, because it would change everything else that has occurred in my life that helped to shape. And cops here are beginning to see the traumas of the job that way. And that's obviously not something that you can share with or say to a victim or a survivor in the immediate moments following the trauma. But the fact that they take that view, I think victims here in San Bruno find empowering, because they're sharing this view with the police officer that shows up to help them, that this is not only survivable, but thrivable. And that if properly integrated and processed, and we work through this the right way, you will emerge infinitely stronger than you went into it. And a lot of times we find that that's the power people need to thrive through these incredibly difficult experiences, right? The cops are experiencing them, but what's more traumatic, I think, for the average cop is they're watching humans experience those things all day, every day. So an officer I've been a cop for almost 20 years. I've been shot at twice. That trauma is so small compared to the 24 to 35 calls that an average officer here will go to today during their shift, and the suffering and trauma they will see and vicariously experience there. And so if they're taking this overall view of trauma differently, I think they can share it. It's not just how they process, it's how they teach others to process.
That's very helpful. And I hadn't even thought of that. I had thought of the trauma that the police would have inflicted on them through being shot at, etc. But I hadn't realized, of course, the vicarious trauma, the witnessing of the suffering, the injustice, the insanity of so much of the worst of life. That's a lot.
I think most cops will tell you that trauma is worse. There's a really great survey a few years back. I think it may have been done by Cal Chiefs, but I'm not positive, that was aimed to identify the top sources of stress for a police officer. And you take a moment to think about like what a police officer does every day, and you would think it would be very easy to identify those sources of stress. But the first one, every single time they do a similar survey, is always the same: crimes involving children as victims. So it's not about getting out of the car in a traffic stop and being afraid of dying, or not going home to your family, or being assaulted, or all the dangers they face. It's watching what humans are sometimes capable of doing to other humans that is the most profound source of stress. And interestingly enough, the second one, in the most recent study, which Chris and I have talked about a lot because I hate to hear it, is their own police administrations. And that to me is an argument in and of itself for the need for integral at the leadership level of police departments.
Yeah. And
could you say a little more about that as far as the police administration?
Yeah, I think that we have a real about face to do. If I am abundantly clear that I serve the police officers in my department, not the other way around. The only person necessary in a police department is someone to answer the 911 call and someone to go to the 911 call. The rest of us are here to support them, plain and simple. And if that's the case, and police officers are saying that the thing I'm most afraid of, the thing that causes me the most hurt and stress, and we know that being in that stress state all the time is counterproductive to our mission in the community and what we want to achieve. How can we not take more seriously the way we're treating cops? And so now we're full circle back to the left quadrants. You could argue there are very few human interactions beyond the most intimate we could think of, like parenthood or marriage, that rival the depth of humanity that occurs in police contact. Right? Police are almost always going to be dealing with someone who is having the worst day of their life, is in some state of profound crisis. And they bring to that contact all of their own baggage and whatever they've been going through personally, professionally, otherwise. And then it's like pouring gasoline in a giant fire and hoping that it doesn't just burn everything down, right? Where someone's got to show up there and be the fire retardant and cool things down. And if one of the reasons that cop's not in the best place is because they're afraid of their boss, I just don't even know where to begin with that if you're not willing to then look in the mirror as a police executive and say, what are we doing wrong? And if you're looking at the need to support them, to me, it's all very easy to see, but it's become clear to me that it's not quite so easy for others to see, or maybe it just represents such a profound change that we're not universally ready for it yet. To think about the human first all the time. And, in policing, we have this profound forgiveness dichotomy that is so difficult to reconcile. We want cops to be infinitely forgiving. Go out there. It doesn't matter. This person just killed their child. Treat them with respect and do the best you can to do your job. And then what we do with cops is every little mistake they make, we want to put them in the gallows. And you can't, that's not how life works. That double standard doesn't work. And so I think that's getting to the core of what this disconnect is and why cops fear their administrations. They honestly think that they're going to do the best they can, but something's going to go bad, as it often does in this line of work, and that their administration is going to hang them out to dry, publicly and otherwise. And as a result, they're terrified to go out and do their jobs. They feel unsupported, and that's a problem. And it's not even just with critical incidents. I know, Chris, not to call you out here, but you had a very different law enforcement experience than maybe you could have had, because that support maybe wasn't always there in even less obvious fashions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the double standard that I think it really gets to police officers. With police reform, there's these calls for procedural justice on the street, and police officers pausing to give people a voice and to take the time to explain the decision they're making, which is absolutely the right thing to do once things are safe and settled. Yet organizationally, we're not doing that. So if we expect our police officers to exude procedural justice on the street, but we're not giving them organizational justice within the walls of the police department and within their career, then, of course, they're going to have unsatisfying careers. And of course, we're going to have unsatisfying outcomes. And of course, they're not going to treat, members of the public any better than they're being treated within their police department. It's not, Ryan is rare. I am really sad to say. Ryan is where policing should be going and where police leadership should be going. And I don't think that the vast numbers, and, I read all the police literature, and police executive research forums always putting out information. And I mean, there's so much information to support that we need a more servant-based leadership. And, Ryan talked about, I'm here to serve the officers, not the other way around. It's huge. And how do we get there? And that's where, again, integral theory comes in with developmental stuff. We have to find ways to develop leaders and develop police officers, not just within the training of how to be a cop, but within the development of being a human, and what those developmental levels look like. And one of the things that excites me the most with integral theory is perspective taking, and if we can get police officers to understand perspective taking and even be interested in it and even, pursue it and be perspective seekers, we could change law enforcement. And, and you don't get that without leaders who are willing to do that.
Yeah, when I was in it's a 6 months program going through to become an MP on this, through your unit, and the last half of that was done with the Marine Corps, which they just pile in right out of boot camp and start training with us. And one of the things I really admired about the Marines, and still do, they have this principle that the last person to get fed is the officers. All your men, everybody's squared away, and then you can have something to eat, which I just think it's moving, but it's also a metaphor of exactly what you were saying, both of you, as leadership, being a servant, and Jesus said, the greatest among you be the servant of all. And God, that I'm sure Chris, from your experience, and Ryan, how that kind of leadership at the top makes all the difference. And the zeitgeist that we were going through now in the last few years, where the police are being scapegoated, right, for obviously some really super bad criminal things happen, and we saw it, but that's the exception, and I think it's a very strange time, and in conservative politics now, they attack the FBI, they attack the DOJ, the law enforcement becomes the bad guys, and it's like this through the looking glass period. Politically, things have changed so rapidly, and yeah, how do you particularly surf that wave? And are the officers on the street aware of things changing right now as far as how they're viewed in general?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I talk to peers all the time who are still in the profession, and there's general universal agreement that it's a really tough time to be a cop. When I started as a cop, there was much more reverence and
That's right.
appreciation, and kids who wanted to grow up to be police officers. And that has definitely been flipped around. And Ryan and I talk about the pendulum swings all the time, and I think that pendulum will probably come back. And it's a really good time. A lot came out of what happened with George Floyd. And, it was a tragedy, but a lot of things have come out of that. And like his daughter said, my daddy's a hero because it has brought all of this awakening. And that happened in the 40s. There was a very little known case in 1946 of a Army sergeant, Isaac Woodard, who had returned from fighting fascism and racism in Europe and came back to the kind of racism that they couldn't even imagine in Europe. And Isaac Woodard was taking a bus back to his hometown. He went up and asked, he was in uniform, had just been discharged, went up and asked the driver to pull over at the next town so he could use the restroom. The driver told him to get back in the back of the bus, called him the N-word, called him boy. And he stood up for himself because he had just come back from serving his country at war. And he said, I'm a man just like you. The bus driver called ahead to the police department in Batesville, South Carolina. And the police, led by the police chief, drug him off the bus, beat him senselessly to the point of blinding him because they beat him with their batons in the face. He was blinded. And, this case could have been one of thousands of lynching type cases that were occurring in those times, yet it got the attention of the NAACP, of Orson Welles, who had a nightly radio show, and it eventually got the attention of President Truman, who his family had been Confederates and owned slaves, and he was known to be racist. But there was something that just kind of shocked the conscience of people at that time, that somebody returning for war would be treated that way. And there's a lot to the story, but it eventually led to a judge being so awakened by what had happened that he was a white judge, a key factor in the eventual Brown versus Board of Education ruling, that brought equality to schools, racial equality. And that was a clarion call of the 1940s. But then what happened to it? And here we are with George Floyd, and what is going to happen to this era? Are we just going to let it go where people don't know about it? I mean, one of my hypotheses is that if police officers understood that history, what police officers did in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 90s and currently, not all, of course, because I agree 100%. I also love cops. Cops are amazing, exceptional people. Yet, if we ignore what these communities have suffered at the hands of police officers, then we're just wasting, all of that suffering. Ryan talks about, turning that suffering and trauma into something good. Well, we need to do that with history. Can you imagine if police officers knew all of that kind of history, like what happened to Isaac Woodard, and then faced people talking about Black Lives Matter, what a difference there would be? I mean, and that's just the perspective taking, that we can turn things around. So what are we going to create? Where are we going to let the pendulum go in the George Floyd era of policing? What we have to do is figure out how to take care of the community and how to take care of the cops. I'm definitely preaching and going off on a tangent, but there's so much passion for the potential of this era and what we can do for police officers and for the community.
Brilliant. I have this question I've been saving for you guys. So say I'm God. In some sense I am, but not in the narcissistic sense. So are you. If you could just for 1 year have your way, and you don't have to fix the whole world, but just to your chosen profession, your comrades, police officers, what changes would you institute, and how would you make things better for for the current officers and the generations that are coming up?
I would have them go work for Ryan Johansen in San Bruno.
Hey, I hear you, sister. I'm totally on board.
No, what's going on here in San Bruno? I mean, the people who work here are exceptional, even just that they're willing to entertain and consider the things that I've suggested over the last, 5 years. It's a perfect storm of people who are open-minded to doing things differently. If I were to answer your question, John, and this is the wild hypothesis, right? Is if my operating hypothesis is that by taking better care of cops, they'll take better care of the community, then that's what I would change. I would focus leadership, policy, legislation on legitimately taking better care of cops. And what I would mean by that is creating the healthy coping mechanisms to address the regular challenges of this job so that they can be at their absolute best as often as is humanly possible. And I think that that's where the focus would need to be put. To Chris's point, this pendulum swing is, in my view, it's never good. It just, all it does is swing from one extreme to the other. And I'm watching it happen right now as a police leader in California, right? The pendulum swing of legislation after George Floyd went all the way to one side, where we're talking about defunding cops and taking powers away from cops. And should they have equipment that we think is military equipment? And we're undoing years and years and years of learning in many respects that cops don't agree with. But then what happens, right? Crime starts to spike. And many police executives, leaders are seeing that very opportunistically, that, well, now communities are afraid. They're afraid of crooks again. They're afraid of crime again. Now they need us again. So we let the pendulum swing all the way back up here. And we use that fear to try to get back where we were before the reform calls. And therein lies the error. Leadership has got to be there to grab that pendulum and stop it from swinging so far back up and say, hey, being over here is probably bad. It's a big part of why crime's gotten out of control and people are feeling unsafe in their communities. But swinging it back up to like stop and frisk era is not the way to solve that problem. The middle way is probably the right way. So can we actually learn from these experiences and figure out where we need to be? And I do see that happening, but as a police officer at the tail end of my career and trying to have the greatest impact I can before I walk out so I can hang my hat on something that feels like it mattered, it's not moving fast enough. Plain and simple, it's just not moving fast enough.
Yeah.
So there's not a new synthesis that's arising out of, it's like an integral. We know that nobody's dumb enough to be completely wrong, right? All the time. And there's both of these things, but not finding common ground, but finding the higher ground. And this seems to be the real challenge, and a way that can actually unite people of both, extremes, if you will, and come up with something that's more functional, more hope-giving, more real, more caring and effective.
Yeah, and that embraces the complexity. We had a conversation earlier this week, Chris and I talking with the folks over at Integral Life about the concept of the spiral and the fact that none of us are really at any particular level of consciousness in all possible ways all the time, right? We're vacillating back and forth. And I think they were talking about the challenge that presents for policing. And I suggested that it actually presents exactly the solution we need, because cops sometimes, as a police officer, if I didn't have the capability to regress back into red, I wouldn't be alive to be having this conversation today, because the nature of my job, like there were a couple moments where it was me or it was someone else. That's the way it was going to be. But to operate in red when you then go out and have to help someone in mental health crisis is catastrophic for the community. And so the idea that we have the ability, maybe instead of calling it like the curse of the spiral, we have the ability through the spiral to operate at different levels if we're aware of them, I actually think presents profound promise for policing.
Yeah, I agree. Red represents that warrior mentality. And there's a lot of conversation about, do we want warrior cops or guardian cops or peacekeeper cops? Well, Integral says we need it all.
Yeah.
We need cops to be able to drop into all of those different things depending on the circumstance that they're presented with.
Yeah,
And
what I hear
also-
you saying,
I'm sorry, Roger, go ahead.
yeah, what I hear is a common theme across a variety of professions, and that is the need for flexibility and appropriateness in the moment, which is one of the definitions of practical wisdom, the capacity for responding skillfully to the situation in this moment. That's almost a definition of practical wisdom. And in my profession, and for example, psychotherapy, one of the key features of effective therapists is they're responding in this moment to what's needed and the next moment to what's needed. And it does require flexibility, and it requires a flexibility of, and you were both referring to this earlier, a bigger self-concept rather than just law enforcement, just this, just that, a willingness to embrace a variety of identities and to trust one can call on the appropriate one in the appropriate moment, because they are really different functions and different identities.
They sure are. And for police officers, they're having to jump between those so rapidly and sometimes at the extremes. I mean, you can literally go from a call that requires nothing but the most profound compassion to have any kind of reasonable resolution straight to an active shooter incident where you have to go by yourself and run towards gunshots and engage in a gun battle with another human and think about taking their life. It's really, really quite profound. And I love the way you said that it requires not just the ability, but the awareness, the present moment awareness to recognize the need and to recognize your ability to settle into those different roles.
Yeah, I think I'm glad, Ryan, I'm so glad you brought that up, because before I was thinking about this, and Chris, and we had a conversation a few weeks ago. The developmental aspect of the integral model is so important, not just to be able to go from red back to orange to green to second tier, but to understand where you're at as a cop. What are I'm a very traditional cop. Okay, I see things. I go to Baptist church every Sunday, and that's kind of where my value system is. But not everybody on your street is. So learning where you're at and how this works developmentally, first of all, gives you perspective on yourself. Like, okay, I'm not, this is not the only value system that has some legitimacy in the world. This is mine. But learning to speak to people in the language that they are. And even as I live most of my time in a southern city right now, and in Louisiana, and very, very conservative thing. And I talk to people, basically, I say, God bless you and thank you. And I just, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. I just have adopted to a way that would sound pretty weird in San Francisco, right? But so learning that helps us to be, or if you go into a situation that requires just strong leadership, shut up, sit down, this, that, and the other, and you get all green and sweet on them, it's going to just fly apart in your face, and they're not going to respect you. And I worked with drug addicts for many years. And the early days of treatment, we had to be just sit down, shut up. You're the stupidest person in the room, and you don't know shit about recovery. So you're going to have to just let it go and listen for a while and do what you're told. And it's like, okay. But that was also based on the fact they knew I loved and cared about them. We built that in. So you have to be able to, to do this. And you as a leader, you have to be able to talk to your men, talk to your people on the street, and also go appear before Congress and I don't know, whatever level that is. I mean, there's all these different hats. And I think understanding that, instead of saying there's just one way to be, because we are a very, very diverse country, and people are getting their power and their money by exacerbating our differences instead of bringing it together. So the understanding of that and bringing that into the policing calling, I should say, is a huge leap forward. And have you had any experience with kind of bringing that into with police officers into training?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's lower right quadrant components that work against everything we're trying to achieve, right? And as you change those, you become an outlier and it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes among your peer groups. As an example, look at how I'm dressed. We have to be dressed in a way that we're easily identifiable, right? But this idea that you should take all of the things that make you you and check them at the door when you walk into the police department and instead become a police officer. That's what you have to be today. There are practical ways to break down those barriers that now in California look pretty normal, that they don't look normal everywhere. You're not going to see a lot of police chiefs with Buddhist tattoos all over their arms. You're not going to see cops with ear piercings, a variety of uniforms. But the message that we've tried to deliver here, especially as new folks are coming in the door, is like, I hired you because of you. And I hope you will bring you to every single aspect of this job every single day. And if that means that your sleeve tattooed, then great. I embrace it. I love it. I'm here for you. Let's do that. Let's see how that works into how you do this job. But it's not normal. And there are so many problems with conforming into what you think it means to be a police officer, especially early in your career, because you're going to watch something and think, oh, to be a cop, I got to do what that 35-year vet just did. I got to show complete indifference to this person who's suffering and scream and yell at them, or just be this voice of authority that's commanding people do things all the time. And then it just becomes a habit and it breaks them down over time. So I think even these little changes, they are very little, I acknowledge them, but they make a big difference. Like in this county, when we started allowing tattoos and facial hair and not making all the female officers pull their hair up super tight and look, very much the same, it's not met with welcoming. There's this argument that to be effective in policing, we have to be very paramilitary. We have to all look the same, act the same, talk the same. And I think one of the byproducts of that is that that blue veil gets put up and we really start this us versus them thing, even in our physical appearance. And that's where the curse, you asked earlier about what do we do about the public seeing us differently? We have to accept our culpability there, right? I don't think it's right to blame a good cop for something a bad cop did. But one thing we do in policing is we give unequivocal support for our nominal in-group way too often. Like, you're in our group just because you're a cop. I have news for you. If you kneel on the neck of someone and let them die, you're not a part of my in-group. And in policing, we have been reluctant to acknowledge that historically. We say, got to defend what that guy did. He's part of us. He's a brother. He's a cop. And so I've got to stick up for him. And I think that comes in part from what we do here institutionally. We look the same, we talk the same, we act the same, and therefore we can do no wrong as long as we're the same. And that's not isolated to only cops. It's just more catastrophic with police because what we do every day and the volatility of our interactions.
You're pointing to the us versus them mentality that I assume must be exacerbated by the intensity of the interactions. And we all have that as part of our nature, unless you grow to extraordinarily mature spiritual levels. There's always going to be that dichotomy, me versus them, us versus them. But I assume it must be more so in a profession where there is under such intensity, emotional intensity and danger.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that not even just the intensity, but frequency, right? It's when you witness the same suffering with such regularity, you have to create an explanation for it. And oftentimes, unfortunately, it's an us versus them way of coping.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things that this segues into, and it actually comes back to something you alluded to before, Ryan, is that we expect, understandably, we do expect very high standards from police in very intense situations. And you've both described an extensive training. There could always be more, of course. And yet, in the heat of the moment, under the intensity of life-threatening situations or intense suffering, it's like the cerebral cortex goes out the window and you're operating on reflexes. And how to maintain those kind of standards under those situations I'd love to hear you talk to that.
No, I think.
Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
No, go ahead, Chris, please.
Well, it points to one of the things that we talk about is the whole right hand versus left hand again, the exterior versus interior. My agency that I retired from has over 900 policies and procedures. And how is anybody going to hold on to that many policies and procedures, especially under stress, as you pointed to, Roger? So, Ryan always says exceptional people make exceptional cops. That's what we have to focus on, is the interior, is how do we get our police officers to move more from a us versus them to a us as them? How do we get our police officers, to understand that there's different ways of doing this job that are more heart-centered versus mind-centered, and that's the work, is getting our officers there individually, because that exceptional person who hasn't been ruined by police culture in some agencies, not all, is going to do the right thing or the wrong thing, regardless of those 900 policies and procedures. So that's the path. The path is to develop our officers as people, as practitioners, doing the integral life practice type things of waking up practices and growing up practices so that they can show up. And it doesn't seem like it's easy, but if you gave, Ryan or an exceptional police leader a year to mold, police officers into that more guardian, peacekeeping, caring model that occasionally drops into warrior versus the other way around, we could change policing. It would be a police transformation.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's often said that, to answer your question about, how you react in that moment, it's often said, especially by tactical officers, that you will not rise to the occasion in the heat of the moment. You will revert to your lowest level of training. And so this where training, yes, of course, becomes very important, right? You indoctrinate the response to a threat, and then you just go into autopilot mode, and you have to trust that the autopilot mode is appropriate because you ingrained it through training. But I think that that's an oversimplified explanation that removes the human condition from that decision, that even when there's a split-second decision, it's still a decision. And somewhere within the human psyche, a decision to respond gets made, and then you revert back to your lowest level of training. And that's where I think that dealing with the interior is so important. So, for example, if you really internalize the idea that we hold human life to be sacrosanct, that what we're really here for, our purpose on this earth, is to defend and protect human life. That's why you are here. And if that's the case, even in a critical incident, you're not going to be first. Your first response is not going to be to take another human life, right? And I think that's very important. And yet, again, if you're holding sacrosanct preserving human life, it means that you won't fail to act when doing so is required to preserve human life. You won't run into Uvalde, Texas. You won't run into Parkland, Florida, because as a well-adjusted cop who really understands your purpose and sees it as much larger even than yourself, you're going to do what's required in that moment because you know that you not acting means lives are being lost. But conversely, it means that when you're faced with a decision where you could lawfully shoot and kill a suspect, there's a threat that you're meeting that you can lawfully do it, something in you will ask if that's completely necessary or the only way to resolve the situation before you pull the trigger. Because at the end of the day, that reverence for human life, they're often, yes, you're okay to shoot that person, but there often are other alternatives, at least in the immediate, that may result in something a bit different. And it's hard for cops to understand that, right? You talk about retreat. And it's even codified in law that officers are never under any obligation to retreat. And I think that that's incredibly important, because as soon as you say we are under an obligation to retreat, we lose some of our ability to protect the public. But is there a point at which retreat might actually be the most appropriate action if what you value the most is human life? And I think the classic example of that is a traffic stop on a stolen vehicle where the subject emerges from the vehicle with a gun and they're ready to shoot it out with the police. Well, if me shooting that suspect means I get to go home tonight, then that's what probably needs to happen, right? I'm not obligated to sacrifice my own life and just sit there and be shot. However, the reality is that suspect is probably most interested in escape. And the shooting is their effort to escape this situation. And so if, and that is a big capital I, if there is a means by which I can survive the immediate altercation without taking that subject's life, and then he takes off fleeing, which is what they want to do in the first place, and we can pursue a less punctuated exchange in which to get that person into custody and protect society from them. Those are the kind of conversations we have to have as police officers. And I think if that reverence for human life is deeply ingrained, then maybe in that one split second where the decision's being made, we'll make some slightly different ones that might create greater trust from the public.
Maybe so. Yeah.
And you're that close to being, to being a monster or a hero based on that decision that you make. I saw a video, I'm sure you guys have seen it. It was a while back, I don't know, maybe year and a half ago, where these two women are in a fight, two black women, and there's people just standing around watching, and a cop shows up, and this woman pulls out a knife, and she's going after her. I mean, he's a powerful woman. She's going to kill or desperately maim this person. And he immediately shoots her. I mean, the split-second decision, and I was going, oh my God, thank you that I never had to do that. But he actually did the right thing. And I remember a lot of people were mad. It was right, Black Lives Matters and all this. And LeBron James, and I have a lot of respect for, wrote this scathing thing about it. Then he saw the video and he said, well, I guess I better keep my mouth shut until I know what's going on, And it was the absolute right decision. But that was just an example of saving a life and making that split-second decision in the moment. That was incredible. And I wish that would had more, people had talked about that more as what it's like. So you know what I'm talking about? You know the video? Yeah. Heavy stuff, gentlemen, ladies, folks.
I would be, let's see, let me back up. And we've talked a little bit about the culture. We haven't actually named it as culture wars, but the intense polarization in our culture at the moment, and the way we have alluded to the way that is affecting police, both directly and indirectly. And one of the things that happens with police is clearly, and here we're going back to the narrow spectrum view of the role, is law enforcement and symbols of state power, that police are very potent Rorschach tests, and the people project, all of us, myself, all of us, we project onto everyone, but it seems more intensely, more dramatically onto police as symbols of many, many things. And to those projections, we bring everything from our personal traumas, our relationship to authority figures, father, past interactions, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's got to be very impactful to be on the receiving end of those projections. So, I'm a psychiatrist. We get a lot of training in dealing with projection. But I'm sure the intensity of the projection of what I get is only a fraction of what you get. I'd love to hear you speak to how that is.
Yeah, this is where I have a belief that training our police officers or teaching our police officers about the elements of integral theory could really help with that. When I retired, I knew nothing about integral theory. I knew nothing about developmental levels. And certainly the culture wars were raging then, just as they are now. And when I started learning about integral theory and understood that my developmental level didn't jive with the developmental level of my police department, it was hugely healing. I mean, it was like taking the blinders off and allowing me to understand, where I fit in and why, and where I didn't fit in and why. And the developmental stuff explains that really well. I mean, when I listen to Steve McIntosh or Jeff Salzman talk about developmental things, the world just starts to make sense. And that could happen for police officers, where that projection doesn't become as personal because the world is starting to make sense to them from a developmental perspective.
Well said. Yeah, incredibly well said. The challenge is how to do it, right? And we've talked about that so much. How deep of a dive can you do to take your typical line level police officer, which I understand is a bit counterintuitive, but your typical line level police officer coming in the door and try to teach them these concepts. But I feel like it's time that we have to do it, because you're completely right. I think one of our first conversations, Chris, we talked about this idea of conveying to cops that their fundamental role is the the health of the entire spiral, right? Like that it's not for you to protect only those with whom you agree with the way they're living their lives or their developmental level. In fact, what makes your calling so noble is you protect it all. And even someone who's operating at a very, low developmental level or level of consciousness, your duty is to defend them as well. And if that was embraced, how differently your average cop would go about their daily duties is profound.
Beautifully said, and said from a mature perspective, simply to acknowledge that our role is to serve people at all who think very different, not only who look differently from us, but who think very differently from us and don't like us at all. That takes a lot. Takes a lot. Yeah. So deep bow to that, to the fact that that is an aspiration. Yeah. Well, there's a lot here. Please, I'd just like to open it up to both of you. What don't we know enough to ask you? What don't I? John's been in this world. I haven't. I sit in the comfort of my office in a psychotherapy chair. What else should we be talking about?
Chris?
Well, I definitely want to take the opportunity, for any police officer or community member who works with the police, to consider integral theory as an approach that could really assist in transforming policing in a really good way. And Integral Life has been wonderful to both me and Ryan as far as educating us. And anybody who's interested to go to integrallife.com and do the introductory course. And there's especially, we were talking about developmental levels, and Corey DeVos put together this amazing cinematic experience of the developmental levels through movies. I mean, it's just fun, easy watching. And if there's anybody out there interested in this kind of work, please reach out to us through Integral Life. Ryan and I are both working with the Institute of Applied Meta Theory on the Integrative Policing Transformation Initiative. And we need more people. We want to make this not just Chris and Ryan thinking about how to apply integral to policing. We want to broaden that group to get as many perspectives as possible, because we both believe in our heart of hearts that bringing integral to policing would be just really significant and huge for not just the community, which is critically important, that's why we're here, but also for the experience of the individual officer. I just think so many times about how different my career would have been, if I had had this tool, this understanding of self and others. So I just wanted to take the moment before we run out of time to make sure that call is put out there, and just reach out to me or Ryan and let's have a conversation and share thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's so wonderful. I'm so grateful to you guys for inviting us to do this, because the more that we're able to talk about this, the more likely it is to gain some traction. And if you had asked me to come on and talk about this stuff even a year and a half, 2 years ago, I probably would have very respectfully and regrettably declined, because we're trying to do things that were completely unproven. And so I would just speak to other maybe police executives, officers, aspiring leaders that are curious about how things might be different, to reach out, because we're no longer in that experimental phase. I think here in San Bruno, it's a microcosm, I get it. And we're a relatively small department. We're not, LAPD, where scaling this might be difficult. But if you look globally at what law enforcement's experiencing, right? Catastrophic recruitment retention crisis. I mean, on a level that we have never experienced before. We are very close to not only many departments not being able to provide safety because they can't put the minimum number of cops on the street needed, but we are destroying existing police officers because of that to try to bridge the gap. You have cops in many departments that are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, mandatoried in for overtime, not getting their days off, not able to get adequate sleep, neglecting their diet and nutrition. And that's going to push the cops we do have out of the career. It's going to make them not as effective. And it's really deterring new officers from coming into the career. In San Bruno, we are fully staffed. I think we're one of maybe 2 or 3 departments in the entire state of California that can say that right now. We had an independent group come in following George Floyd, an activist group out of Oakland, to conduct a thorough assessment of the police department, its practices, whether or not there was bias that needed to be addressed, the level of satisfaction of officers here. And the surveys were through the roof. I can confidently say that morale here, despite arguably one of the most difficult times in history to be a police officer, our morale is the highest it's been in the 20 years that I've worked here. We don't have the recruitment retention problems. The officers are happy, they're healthy, they love their jobs, they understand their purpose, their families support what we're doing here. It works. So if you really think that there might be a better way, I truly believe that this more integral approach in leadership is the holy grail answer to almost all of the wicked problems that policing is facing. And so I really would applaud those who are maybe a little bit more willing to think outside the box and do things differently. I'll couch that and caveat it with saying that there are lower right quadrant issues that make it very difficult for a police leader, at least here in California, to do these things. You know, the average tenure of a police chief in California right now is less than 3 years. There's not a whole lot of change you can make in a 3-year period, especially if you're coming in as an outsider into a new agency. And so that construct creates problems, and self-preservation creates problems. This is all very different. But for those who are maybe a little more bold and you want to do things differently and be part of the future solution, I just would encourage you, as Chris said, check out Integral Life. Please reach out. I think that there's strength in numbers and we can kind of start to drive things a bit differently. I'm happy to share anything and everything we've done here from a practical perspective to get us where we're at, and acknowledge that we are far from perfect. We could have an extremely ugly incident tomorrow, just like any other agency could. But I think we're in a much better place than many agencies, and it's all about looking at things. It's about focusing on the left side, exactly what Chris alluded to.
And both of you are clearly inspired by the mission you've taken on. How do you nurture yourselves in this process? I mean, you've talked about providing support for the officers, people on the street, et cetera, et cetera. What do you both do for yourselves?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I wish I could say I was a strong meditator. It's always eluded me, but I do work with A Course in Miracles and the daily workbook lessons every day. I like to start my day being very grounded in what's possible for me when I come from love versus coming from fear or anger or hatred. And when I can start my day with that and be grounded in that. And then, I certainly have different practices for mind, body, spirit, and, working out and those kind of things. But Course in Miracles has been my mainstay. It keeps me attached and detached, if that makes any sense at all, that I can really care deeply, yet remove myself from the results and release it up to my higher power. So yeah, I could go on and on about very specific practices, but that's the gist of it. And the working out on duty is huge. Like I just commend Ryan for that, because if I didn't have the ability to exercise every day as a retired person, I'd probably go insane working with this material. So chiefs out there, if that's the one thing you can do, let your cops work out on duty. It's huge. It's huge.
And Chris, just so you know, I lit up there because I've been doing Course in Miracles every day for 40 years.
Yeah. Just a funny side note, Roger, is when I first heard about you, Roger Walsh and Francis Vaughn was in the Course in Miracles community. And then I took a shamanism class and read a book by Roger Walsh on shamanism. And then I came into Integral, and there's this guy, Roger Walsh, who does all this work with Integral. And it took me a while to figure out it was all the same person. So it's been quite an honor to meet with you and talk with you. And yeah, I don't want to cut you off, Ryan, from your practice, because I know it's really been important for you in your journey.
No, I mean, mostly the same things, right? I think one thing that I learned early on is that I have to set the example. If I'm going to be preaching all this to my folks, then it doesn't do a lot of good to have a police chief that's 150 pounds overweight and that doesn't sleep and that just grinds it out in the office all day long, showing up and telling you should take care of yourself. So I prioritize those things as a form of service. That I don't look at those things as selfish, that I'm taking care of myself. I look at them as part of my leadership regimen. And as a result, that's what I preach to my folks. And that's how I got the city to agree to let these guys work out on duty. It said that you got to stop. You're seeing it the wrong way. It's not a selfish thing for the cop. It's for the community. Don't you want the cop to be physically fit and mentally in the right place and to be able to go blow off steam and This is, you got to understand this is them investing in others. It's part of their service. And that's been the most profound change. Probably the most frustrating might be the wrong word, but the area where I would have liked to have got more traction is in the meditation space. It's very near and dear to me. I survived a very ugly officer involved shooting early in my career because someone introduced me to meditation instead of going and drinking beer and, burying it like it never happened. And I've tried really hard to share that here. And what I find is the people who tend to come to a longstanding contemplative practice are those who experience a trauma where now they need it. And then they show up in my office and say, Chief, I'm really struggling with something and now I'm ready. And that's great, right? As long as we can get there. I think I mentioned earlier, I put the entire department through our 3.5-day mindfulness retreat intensive to introduce them to just very basic level practices, body scans and breathing and ways to sort of control what's going on in their own little world. And it was very well received, but not a lot of people came back and were practicing it. So that I learned from that. I got 4 officers here certified as mindfulness instructors so that we can continue it on an ongoing basis. And we're starting to get some more traction in that space. Because when you ask about my personal practice, the meditation is absolutely 100% the single most important component of all of it. I understand that if my head and heart aren't right, then nothing else is going to follow, period. And so I prioritize it. I'm sure people don't appreciate it because I'll push off meetings. If it's the meditation time, that's going to happen first. And the other things can wait behind it.
I completely understand.
Yeah, I just want to get this in before we wrap this up, that one of the most important ideas came out of the integral uprising or movement or whatever this thing is the idea of integral life practice, that you've got to work the body, the mind, the interiors, the trauma, and a spiritual practice, however that you connect with that. And that's what I brought to my work with addiction, that the way out of addiction was through an integral life practice. And I'm also the CEO of Awake Technologies, who create audio tracks that entrain the brain to these deeper levels. So if you're interested in that at all, you got it, pro bono. I'll fly out there and show you guys how to use it before you go on duty every day. And I think it could be a huge help and service, because you don't have to wait for years to start feeling the difference. It actually trains the brain to these lower meditative states right off the bat. So if you want it, you got it.
John, I really hope that we can continue that conversation. On the practical note, I've thought for a long time, and there's challenges here, but I've thought for a long time, can you imagine a world where, for example, a police officer gets in their car following a call, and prior to responding to the next call, they sit through exercises with biofeedback to determine where their HRV is sitting, and that we set a standard that, look, you're not going to the next call, emergencies notwithstanding, until you can regulate your HRV and be in the right sort of space to go and do this. And technologies like iAwake are the only way you could ever do something like that, because if you put it on the officer to just get their HRV where it needs to be, they might be sitting in their patrol car for 4 hours having no idea what to do. But if you bring in the technology that can help them to regulate and to learn how to get to that space, again, we want cops in the best place possible when they go into each exchange. Well, what are we actually doing to create that environment? Having them run from call to call to call with no paying mind to what the previous call might bleed into the next call is a huge mistake. So I would really love to talk about, this place can be a trial environment for any kind of outside the box stuff, because these folks are super open-minded. And if we want to, put pen to paper and prove that these kind of things work or don't work, for that matter, in a controlled environment where people are pretty open to it, I would love to have those conversations.
Yeah, and that your officers can carry it right there.
Yeah.
It's right there all the time. And just to get the group, before you go out on a shift, take 10 or 15 minutes, put on your earbuds or headphones and just come together. There's really a field of energy that's created, and it can make a huge difference.
Huge, massive.
Beautiful.
Yeah. It's been such a gift to talk with you both. And I just feel inspired to know that you're both out there, you're both pushing the edge, providing an experimental lab for what can really work to serve both the police and thereby the entire community. I just find that very, very inspiring and beautiful. And thank you both so much for what you're doing.
Yeah, I feel so much just respect and love and honor you guys, who you are and what you're bringing forward. It's really extraordinary. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for having us here. Considering your list of guests, it's such an honor, and it's a real win for policing and for communities to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, I'd just like that. I'm very, very appreciative for the opportunity to talk to you guys and hopefully to continue the conversation, because I have a lot to learn. And I'm learning a ton from Chris. And I think that acknowledging what she's doing right now, I'm always in awe of the dedication post-career, right? It's one thing for me. I have an immediate incentive-based system to try to change things and to be involved. But this is Chris's level of commitment to policing and to the belief that it can be better has extended beyond 30 years of service, is incredibly impressive. And the thesis work she's doing, and I know the dissertation, these have the potential to really change the game. And so, Chris, I'm insanely grateful to you as well for including me in this and for bringing me into this conversation.
Beautiful. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.